Carl Gustav Jung, often referred to as a C.G. Jung, was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychotherapist who founded analytical psychology. His work has been influential not only in psychiatry but also in philosophy, anthropology, archaeology, literature, and religious studies. He was a prolific writer, though many of his works were not published until after his death. The central concept of analytical psychology is individuation, the psychological process of integrating the opposites, including the conscious with the unconscious, while still maintaining their relative autonomy. Jung considered individuation to be the central process of human development. Jung created some of the best-known psychological concepts, including the archetype, the collective unconscious, the complex, and extroversion and introversion. Biography. Early years. Childhood. Family. Carl Gustav Jung was born in Kesswil, in the Swiss canton of Thurgau, on 26 July 1875 as the second and first surviving child of Paul Achilles Jung and Emily Priestwerk. Emily was the youngest child of Samuel Priestwerk and his wife. The senior Priestwerk was a wealthy professional man who taught Paul Achilles Jung as his professor of Hebrew. Jung's father was a poor rural pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church. His mother had grown up in a wealthy Swiss family. When Jung was 6 months old, his father was appointed to a more prosperous parish in Laufen, but the tension between his parents was growing. Emily Jung was an eccentric and depressed woman. She spent considerable time in her bedroom, where she said that spirits visited her at night. Jung had a better relationship with his father. Although she was normal during the day, Jung said that at night his mother became strange and mysterious. Jung said that one night he saw a faintly luminous and indefinite figure coming from her room with a head detached from the neck and floating in the air in front of the body. Jung's mother left Laufen for several months of hospitalization near Basel for an unknown physical ailment. His father took the boy to be cared for by Emily Jung's unmarried sister in Basel, but he was later brought back to his father's residence. Emily Jung's continuing bouts of absence and often depressed mood influenced her son's attitude towards women, one of innate unreliability. This was a view that he later called the handicap I started off with. He believed it contributed to his sometimes patriarchal views of women, but these were common in his society. After 3 years of living in Laufen, Paul Jung requested a transfer. He was called to Kleinhüningen next to Basel in 1879. The relocation brought Emily Jung in closer contact to her family and lifted her melancholy. Childhood memories. Jung was a solitary and introverted child. From childhood he believed that, like his mother, he had two personalities, a modern Swiss citizen and a personality more suited to the 18th century. Personality number one, as he termed it, was a typical schoolboy living in the era of the time. Personality number two was a dignified, authoritative and influential man from the past. Although Jung was close to both parents, he was disappointed by his father's academic approach to faith. A number of childhood memories made lifelong impressions on him. As a boy he carved a tiny mannequin into the end of the wooden ruler from his pencil case and placed it inside the case. He added a stone which he had painted into upper and lower halves, and hid the case in the attic. Periodically he would return to the mannequin, often bringing tiny sheets of paper with messages inscribed on them in his own secret language. He later reflected that this ceremonial act brought him a feeling of inner peace and security. Years later he discovered similarities between his personal experience and the practices associated with totems in indigenous cultures, such as the collection of soul stones near Altheim or the Churungas of Australia. He concluded that his intuitive ceremonial act was an unconscious ritual, which he had practiced in a way that was strikingly similar to those in distant locations which he, as a young boy, knew nothing about. His conclusions about symbols, psychological archetypes, and the collective unconscious were inspired, in part, by these experiences. At the age of 12, shortly before the end of his first year at the Humanistisches Gymnasium in Basel, Jung was pushed to the ground by another boy so hard that he momentarily lost consciousness. A thought then came to him: now you won't have to go to school anymore. From then on, whenever he walked to school or began homework, he fainted. He remained at home for the next 6 months until he overheard his father speaking hurriedly to a visitor about the boy's future ability to support himself. They suspected he had epilepsy. Confronted with the reality of his family's poverty, he realized the need for academic excellence. He went into his father's study and began poring over Latin grammar. He fainted 3 more times, but eventually overcame the urge and did not faint again. This event, Jung later recalled, was when I learned what a neurosis is. University studies. In early career, Jung did not plan to study psychiatry since it was not considered prestigious at the time. But, studying a psychiatric textbook, he became very excited when he discovered that psychoses are personality diseases. His interest was immediately captured. It combined the biological and the spiritual, exactly what he was searching for. In 1895, Jung studied medicine at the University of Basel. In 1900, Jung began working at the Burg-Holtzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich with Eugen Bleuler. Bleuler was already in communication with the Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud. Jung's dissertation, published in 1903, was titled On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena. In 1906, he published Studies in Word Association, and later sent a copy of this book to Freud. Eventually, a close friendship and a strong professional association developed between the elder Freud and Jung, which left a sizable trove of correspondence. For 6 years they cooperated in their work. In 1912, however, Jung published Wandlungen und Symbol der Libido, which made manifest the developing theoretical divergence between the two. Consequently, the personal and professional relationship fractured, each stating that the other was unable to admit he could possibly be wrong. After the culminating break in 1913, Jung went through a difficult and pivotal psychological transformation, exacerbated by the outbreak of the First World War. Henry Ellenberger called Jung's intense experience a creative illness, and compared it favorably to Freud's own period of what he called neurasthenia and hysteria. Wartime army service. During World War I, Jung was drafted as an army doctor and soon made commandant of an internment camp for British officers and soldiers. Jung worked to improve the conditions of soldiers stranded in neutral territory and encouraged them to attend university courses. Marriage. In 1903, Jung married Emma Rauschenbach, who was a daughter of a wealthy family in Switzerland. They had 5 children: Agathe, Gret, Franz, Marianne, and Ellen. The marriage lasted until Emma's death in 1955. During his marriage, Jung engaged in extramarital relationships. His affairs with Sabina Spielrein and Tony Wolff were the most widely known. Midlife isolation. It was the publication of Jung's book Psychology of the Unconscious in 1912 that led to the break with Freud. Letters they exchanged show Freud's refusal to consider Jung's ideas. This rejection caused what Jung described in his autobiography Memories, Dreams, Reflections as a resounding censure. Everyone he knew dropped away except for 2 of his colleagues. Jung described his book as an attempt, only partially successful, to create a wider setting for medical psychology and to bring the whole of the psychic phenomena within its purview. London 1913-14. Jung spoke at meetings of the Psychomedical Society in London in 1913 and 1914. His travels were soon interrupted by the war, but his ideas continued to receive attention in England primarily through the efforts of Constance Long. He translated and published the first English volume of his collected writings, Red Book, in 1913. At the age of 38, Jung experienced a horrible confrontation with the unconscious. He saw visions and heard voices. He worried at times that he was menaced by a psychosis, or was doing a schizophrenia. He decided that it was valuable experience and, in private, he induced hallucinations or, in his words, active imaginations. He recorded everything he felt in small journals. Jung began to transcribe his notes into a large red leather-bound book, on which he worked intermittently for 16 years. Jung left no posthumous instructions about the final disposition of what he called the Red Book. His family eventually moved it into a bank vault in 1984. Songu Shamdasani, a historian from London, for 3 years tried to persuade Jung's heirs to have it published, to which they declined every hint of inquiry. As of mid-September 2009, fewer than 24 people had seen it. Ulrich Hoheney, Jung's grandson who manages the Jung archives, decided to publish it to raise the additional funds needed when the Philemon Foundation was founded. In 2007, 2 technicians for Digital Fusion, working with the publisher, W. Norton and Company, scanned the manuscript with a 10,200 pixel scanner. It was published on 7 October 2009, in German with separate English translation along with Shamdasani's introduction and footnotes at the back of the book. According to Sarah Corbett for The New York Times, she wrote, "The book is bombastic, baroque, and like so much else about Carl Jung, a willful oddity, cinched with an antediluvian and mystical reality." The Rubin Museum of Art in New York City displayed the original Red Book journal, as well as some of Jung's original small journals, from 7 October 2009 to 15 February 2010. According to them, during the period in which he worked on this book, Jung developed his principal theories of archetypes, collective unconscious, and the process of individuation. 2/3 of the pages bear Jung's illuminations of the text. Final publications and death. Jung continued to publish books until the end of his life, including Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies, which analyzed the archetypal meaning and possible psychological significance of the reported observations of UFOs. He also enjoyed a friendship with an English Roman Catholic priest, Father Victor White, who corresponded with Jung after he had published his controversial answer to Job. Jung died on 6 June 1961 at Kusennacht, after a short illness. Relationship with Freud. Meeting Freud. Jung was 30 when he sent his studies in word association to Sigmund Freud in Vienna in 1906. The two men met for the first time the following year, and Jung recalled the discussion between himself and Freud as interminable. He recalled that they talked almost unceasingly for 13 hours. 6 months later, the then 50-year-old Freud sent a collection of his latest published essays to Jung in Zurich. This marked the beginning of an intense correspondence and collaboration that lasted 6 years and ended in May 1913. At this time Jung resigned as the chairman of the International Psychoanalytical Association, where he had been elected with Freud's support. Jung and Freud influenced each other during the intellectually formative years of Jung's life. Freud called Jung his adopted eldest son, his crown prince and successor. In 1906, psychology as a science was still in its early stages. Jung, who had become interested in psychiatry as a student by reading Psychopathia Sexualized by Richard von Krafft-Ebing, a professor in Vienna, by then worked as a doctor under the psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler in Bergholzli. He became familiar with Freud's idea of the unconscious through reading Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. He became a proponent of the new psychoanalysis. At the time, Freud needed collaborators and pupils to validate and spread his ideas. Bergholzli was a renowned psychiatric clinic in Zurich, and Jung's research had already gained him international recognition. Jung emphasized the importance of sexual development and focused on the collective unconscious, the part of unconscious that contains memories and ideas that he believed were inherited from ancestors. While he did think that libido was an important source for personal growth, unlike Freud, Jung did not believe that libido alone was responsible for the formation of the core personality. Journal editor in 1908, Jung became an editor of the newly founded Yearbook for Psychoanalytical and Psychopathological Research. The following year, Jung traveled with Freud and the Hungarian psychoanalyst Sándor Ferenczi to the United States. They took part in a conference at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. In 1910, Jung became chairman for life of the International Psychoanalytical Association. While Jung worked on his Wandlungen und Symbol der Libido, tensions grew between him and Freud because of their disagreements over the nature of libido and religion. In 1912, these tensions came to a peak because Jung felt severely slighted after Freud visited his colleague Ludwig Binswanger in Kreuzlingen without paying him a visit in nearby Zurich, an incident Jung referred to as the Kreuzlingen gesture. Shortly thereafter, Jung again traveled to the United States and gave the Fordham University lectures, which were published as The Theory of Psychoanalysis. While they contain some remarks on Jung's dissenting view on the libido, they represent largely a psychoanalytical Jung, and not the theory for which he became famous in the following decades. Travels to the U.S. The conference at Clark University was planned by the psychologist G. Stanley Hall and included 27 distinguished psychiatrists, neurologists and psychologists. It represented a watershed in the acceptance of psychoanalysis in North America. This forged welcome links between Jung and influential Americans. Jung returned to the United States the next year for a brief visit, and again for a 6-week lecture series at Fordham University in 1912. Last meetings with Freud in November 1912. Jung and Freud met in Munich for a meeting among prominent colleagues to discuss psychoanalytical journals. At a talk about a new psychoanalytic essay on Amenhotep IV, Jung expressed his views on how it related to actual conflicts in the psychoanalytic movement. While Jung spoke, Freud suddenly fainted and Jung carried him to a couch. Jung and Freud personally met for the last time in September 1913 for the 4th International Psychoanalytical Congress in Munich. Jung gave a talk on psychological types, the introverted and extroverted type in analytical psychology. This constituted the introduction of some of the key concepts which came to distinguish Jung's work from Freud's in the next half-century. Divergence from Freud. Jung's primary disagreement with Freud stemmed from their differing concepts of the unconscious. Jung saw Freud's theory of the unconscious as incomplete and unnecessarily negative. According to Jung, Freud conceived the unconscious solely as a repository of repressed emotions and desires. Jung agreed with Freud's model of the unconscious, what Jung called the personal unconscious, but he also proposed the existence of a second, deeper form of the unconscious underlying the personal one. This was the collective unconscious, where the archetypes themselves resided, represented in mythology by a lake or other body of water, and in some cases a jug or other container. Freud had actually mentioned a collective level of psychic functioning but saw it primarily as an appendix to the rest of the psyche. Travels. Jung emerged from his period of isolation in the late 19-teens with the publication of several journal articles, followed in 1921 with Psychological Types, one of his most influential books. There followed a decade of active publication, interspersed with overseas travels. England 1920–23. Constance Long arranged for him to deliver a seminar in Cornwall in 1920. Another seminar was held in 1923, this one organized by Helton Godwin Baines, and another in 1925. United States 1924–25, 1936–37. Jung made a more extensive trip westward in the winter of 1924–5, financed and organized by Fowler McCormick and George Porter. Of particular value to Jung was a visit with Chief Mountain Lake of the Taos Pueblo near Taos, New Mexico. Jung made another trip to America in 1936, giving lectures in New York and New England for his growing group of American followers. He returned in 1937 to deliver the Terry Lectures, later published as Psychology and Religion, at Yale University, East Africa. In October 1925, Jung embarked on his most ambitious expedition, the Buggeshoe Psychological Expedition, to East Africa. He was accompanied by Peter Baines and an American associate, George Beckworth. On the voyage to Africa, they became acquainted with an Englishwoman named Ruth Bailey, who joined their safari a few weeks later. The group traveled through Kenya and Uganda to the slopes of Mount Elgon, where Jung hoped to increase his understanding of primitive psychology through conversations with the culturally isolated residents of that area. Later he concluded that the major insights he had gleaned had to do with himself and the European psychology in which he had been raised. India. In December 1937, Jung left Zurich again for an extensive tour of India with Fowler McCormack. In India, he felt himself under the direct influence of the foreign culture for the first time. In Africa, his conversations had been strictly limited by the language barrier, but in India he was able to converse extensively. Hindu philosophy became an important element in his understanding of the role of symbolism and the life of the unconscious. Though he avoided a meeting with Ramana Maharshi, he described Ramana as being absorbed in the self, but admits to not understanding Ramana's self-realization or what he actually did do. He also admits that his field of psychology is not competent in understanding the Eastern insight of the Atman, the self. Jung became seriously ill on this trip and endured 2 weeks of delirium in a Calcutta hospital. After 1938, his travels were confined to Europe.